prior to 1870, as we know, Germany was about 30 or 40 little kingdoms and states. And then prior to 1806, it was the Holy Roman Empire, where you had maybe about 1,000 little principalities and kingdoms. So the Germans have always been either locally or kind of imperially surrounded by enemies. And so you have to develop military skills in order to protect yourselves and protect your homelands. Now, the dominant culture of Germany in the early 20th century is that of Prussia. Okay? Now, Prussia is, today it's a federal state in Germany. It's the largest federal state in Germany. Its capital is Berlin. Okay? So it is the largest federal state in Germany. But it was, of course, one of the larger German kingdoms historically. And so it is under Prussia that Germany will unify in 1871. And the king of Prussia will become the Kaiser, or the Emperor of Germany. But Prussia has had, of course, no small, over the course of the 17th into the 18th century, no small share of rivals, including the Austrians, the Russians, the Swedish, the French. All of these were bigger than Prussia, and it had plenty of smaller states, too, that could threaten them. And they all compete for centuries for territory in kind of Central Europe, The Prussian military was not particularly wealthy, and in order to compete with its enemies in this disadvantageous region of Germany, it develops a really important military, a very good military, small but good, and very harsh. Discipline in the Prussian military was very, very harsh. And they had the harshest kind of punishments than just about any European state at the time. And one of the doctrines that the Prussians had developed was strike first, strike hard, knock your enemy off balance, win the war in the first big push, right? In the first big battle here. You want to have overwhelming localized numbers and just go and hit them as hard as you can. And a good number of the military commanders in Germany during World War II will be of kind of Prussian military stock. They'll come from these Prussian military families that have had all of these kinds of ideas inculcated into them, not just from the state, but from their own family as well. In fact, under Frederick the Great, who was quite a character, under Frederick the Great, there was the saying that Prussia is not a state that has an army. Prussia is an army that has a state. To kind of give you an idea of just how military-minded the Prussians were at this time. And you can see here, Prussian formation, 7 Years' War. This is linear warfare, right? We're all in a line. We're marching forward. Far more important than the muskets are the bayonets at this period. During the 1920s and 1930s, military thinkers throughout the world, but in particularly in Germany, are looking at the lessons of World War I. We had the trenches. We had these moments where we're trying to go over the top, over the trenches to get at our enemies. And of course, the problem was in World War I, when World War I breaks out, military technology had developed to the point where it favored the defense. Military technology favored the defense. The big one, the machine gun. A machine gun fundamentally is not an offensive weapon, it is a defensive weapon. But also, too, things you wouldn't even think about, like barbed wire. Barbed wire is an important piece of military technology that, again, heavily favors the defense. So much of World War I was all about trench warfare. Staying in the trenches, fighting in the trenches, and then when you've got to, you make a big push, and you send as many guys as you can, and you hope that some of them are left to do the job when they get to the next trench. Right? It's bloody, it's brutal. Men are used as cannon fodder. It's a horrible, horrible way to fight a war. It's an inefficient way to fight a war, and ultimately it is a failure of a way to fight a war. Just the other night I watched one of my favorite films, Paths of Glory. Has anybody ever seen Paths of Glory? It's one of Kubrick's first films. It's absolutely brilliant. It's with Kirk Douglas, and he's a French colonel, and he's ordered to send his men over the top, and and of course they can't take the position, so they try some of the men in the regiment for cowardice, and it's a brilliant film. I highly recommend you check it out if you get a chance. Brilliant film. Well, as a result of World War I, and as these people in the 20s and 30s are thinking about that war, and as technology is changing, they're saying, well, can we not adapt newer technologies to overcome those problems of the First World War, of the trenches, of the barbed wire, of the machine guns? Now, right at the end of the war, you started to have the beginnings of some of these things. You start to see the appearance of the tank toward the end of the war, which is really fundamentally a way of putting metal in between you and the machine guns, right? But these World War I tanks are big, they're heavy. Sometimes, you have 10 men inside one tank. The temperature would be, 130 degrees or something like that in there. Men would faint. I mean, it was not practical, but they become more practical in the interwar period. And tanks, too, fundamentally are seen as a way to replace traditionally, like what cavalry did. Cavalry could get behind the enemy fairly swiftly. Well, cannot tanks do the same thing? And there's this idea of we need to find a way to bring mobility back to the battlefield. Okay? Mobility back to the battlefield. We need to find a way to bring mobility back to the battlefield. So what thinkers in Germany come up with? What thinkers in Germany come up with is a new kind of military formation. Now, we talked about, on the first day, we talked about basic military formations, basic army formations. And the one that I said is very significant is, of course, the division. So the Germans are going to find a way to create a division, essentially have that kind of mobility to the kinds of weapons and what have you in order to bring mobility back to the battlefield.